Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Bible study. I know that several of you, many of you actually, kept going this summer, and every Thursday at noon you got together at Roden Point. I'm so pleased to hear that you stayed together through the summer, but I'm so grateful to be officially back with all of you today as we begin another season of Bible study together. I'm so happy to see all of you. I was so happy to see you all on Sunday as well for Rally Day. But since our first Bible study of the season happened to fall on September 12th, I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity for me to share with you about a man who's become known as the Saint of 9/11. So, hello, come in, Joy. We're just getting started. Typically, for our group, we have refreshments courtesy of Dilip, but Dilip let me know yesterday that he will not be able to provide those treats as we move forward because he's no longer attending that meeting. You know, he would come from a meeting on Thursdays and bring us the leftover food. But he's not a part of that anymore. So if we would like to have treats moving forward, we can figure out a way to do that maybe. Or if this is a time that is going to make you hungry, it's lunchtime, maybe bring your lunch with you to the future meetings. But I'm so grateful to welcome you all here today. We're going to learn in the next hour about a man who has become known as the Saint of 9/11. And whenever I have the opportunity to talk about him, I always say yes, because he was actually someone that I knew and someone that I worked with. He had such a profound impact on my life that a few years ago, I wrote a little book about him. You'll see it there. That's the cover. It's called Mychal's Prayer because he taught me a prayer. And after he was killed on 9/11, I started saying that prayer every single day. And it became so much a part of my spiritual life that I really wanted to share it with other people. And so today you're going to not only learn about Father Mychal, you're also going to learn his prayer. And I hope that it's something that you'll incorporate into your spiritual life as well. So thank you all very much for being here today. There will be time at the end of the presentation for questions. But if during the slideshow you happen to have a question, don't be shy about raising your hands. So let us begin. Mychal's Prayer is a little book that I wrote about Father Mychal Judge. And many people have gotten to know the name Father Mychal Judge because of 9/11. He was there at the World Trade Center because at that time he was the New York City fire chaplain. And it was a job that he loved so much. When he got the call to be the fire chaplain, oh, he was like a little boy. He was so thrilled to get that job, and he loved working with the firefighters. And so he got the call, just like all the firefighters did, about what was going on the morning of September 11th. And so he ran down to the World Trade Center. And while he was there, a piece of the building, as the building was collapsing, a piece of the building fell on him. And he has become known as the first recorded casualty of 9/11. They numbered all of the body bags that day, and his body bag is 00001, the very first recorded casualty of that day. And there's a very famous photograph of that day. It's probably one of the most famous photos now of 9/11, and it's of Father Mychal's lifeless body being carried away from the wreckage by the rescue workers. And it was brought to a local church, and his body was placed on the altar of a local church. Very, very powerful. Terry reminded me this morning, and Bill Peltz told me the other day, that on 60 Minutes this past Sunday, there was a piece about the firefighters and Father Mychal on 9/11, and I'll have to make sure that I see a recording of it. Very, very powerful. But if you want to learn more about Father Mychal outside of this presentation, because I'm only going to scratch the surface today, but if you want to learn more about his life, there's a wonderful documentary. You can find it if you have Amazon Prime, or you can also find it on YouTube. It's a documentary they made about his life. It's called The Saint of 9/11, because that's what he's become known as. And it's narrated by Sir Ian McKellen. It's really a beautiful and very moving film. So we're going to start right at the beginning. Father Mychal was born in 1933 in Brooklyn. And so it was the height of the Great Depression. And Father Mychal, when he was just 6 years old, his father died. And so his mother had to raise him and his two sisters as a widow, a young widow, and at the height of the Depression, when there wasn't a lot of money. And so little Mychal, this isn't a picture of him actually, but I wanted to give you an idea. He, during that time, decided as a little boy that he was going to shine shoes at Penn Station so that he could earn money for the family, because he was now the man of the family, even though he was just a little boy. And so he shined shoes at Penn Station, and he would look across the street, and he would see this sign: Church of St. Francis of Assisi, Franciscan Friars, all are welcome. And he was so attracted not only to that sign, but to the friars who lived there. Many of them were young men, and he was so attracted not only to their charism, but also their work, because what he noticed was they had a bread line out in front of the church, which, as you can see, they still have to this day. The Franciscan Friars on 31st Street in Manhattan, they provide soup and bread for the homeless. And so little Mychal, he was just so attracted to the friars and to their work. He got to know them, and they got to know him. And he decided when he was a teenager that he wanted to become a Franciscan friar as well. And so he attended St. Francis Prep in New York and prepared to become a Franciscan friar. His name, by the way, I should say, his name wasn't Mychal. You know, some of you are familiar where Catholic brothers and nuns, they received a religious name. So growing up, his name was Robert. That was his birth name. But his religious name when he became a friar was Mychal. And he changed it to that unusual spelling, M-Y-C-H-A-L, because he said there were so many other Mychals that were living in his community, it was confusing. So he was going to be that unique spelling that he came up with. But Father Mychal became a Franciscan friar, and there he is as a young man. He was assigned to a parish in New Jersey. And he served actually several parishes throughout New York and New Jersey as a young friar. But, you know, this was in the 1960s and 70s, so he was kind of like the cool hippie priest with, you know, the long hair, and everybody loved him, especially the young people. And so you see him there, one of his first parishes as a young priest, with all of the teenagers in the neighborhood. But he had such a wonderful personality, such a warm personality, that everybody just loved him, and he was a wonderful, wonderful priest. But as you can imagine, that life can be very lonely, even though you're around people all of the time. But, Mychal, like all priests, took those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so he wasn't married, didn't have that in his life. And so Father Mychal, unfortunately, developed a drinking problem. And he became an alcoholic. He told me a story that one day, this is when he knew it was really bad. One morning he woke up and he felt some pain, and he looked down and he saw that he had a shamrock that was tattooed on his behind. And he said, I had no idea how it got there. And he was able to laugh about it then, as we all are. But for him, it was really a scary moment where he realized, I blacked out again. I don't even know how this happened. I don't even know how I made it back to the friary. He just became, unfortunately, really got into grips of alcohol. The beautiful thing that happened was he went into recovery. And he was very faithful to attending AA meetings almost every day, putting the 12 steps into practice. And I know that there are those of you here who have been in recovery or have family members who've been, and you know really how transformative that can be in your life. I will say probably some of the most spiritual people I've known in my life, some of my greatest spiritual teachers have been people who have gone through recovery. Father Mychal really followed the 12 steps. Now, I know it's hard for you to read the 12 steps there. I know many of you know them very well. But I found this, which I thought was really cool. It kind of just broke down the 12 steps into some simple language. So it says, I can't, God can, let God, look within, admit wrongs, prepare for change, seek God's help, become willing, make amends, daily inventory, pray and meditate, and give it away. And that's exactly the way Mychal lived his life. And especially those last two steps. He was so devoted to prayer and to meditation every single day. And give it away, yes, he did. I mean, he served people every single day. That was his greatest joy. And in fact, he had this quote that said, God is not an obligation or a burden. God is the joy of my life. So for him, following those 12 steps, forgiving, serving, praying, he didn't see any of that as a burden. He saw it as such a great joy. And that's really how he lived his life. So Father Mychal, after he had gone through recovery, was not in a parish anymore, was not a parish priest. He was assigned to move into that place that he saw as a little boy when he was shining shoes at Penn Station. And he looked across the street and he saw that sign. That's where he was assigned. He was assigned to live there, and he was assigned to work there. There's a church there, and a school there, and residences for the priests. And so he lived there in community. There were about 15 priests that were living there, and that's when I got to know him. So this was in the 1990s, and some of you know that before I became a pastor in the United Church of Christ, as a young man, I was a religious brother in the Catholic Church. And this is a picture of me as a young brother. So those are what they call the habits we wore, the robes that we wore. The order of brothers that I belonged to was called the Marist Brothers. That's why I'm standing next to a statue of Mary. Our order was devoted to Mary, Jesus' mother. Father Mychal was a Franciscan. His order was devoted to St. Francis of Assisi. But when I was a young brother, we were school teachers. The Marist Brothers run schools all around the United States. So we were teachers. But in the summer, our order didn't want us to just sit on the beach and do nothing. They wanted us to continue to do work in the summer. And we were asked to do whatever it was we felt we wanted to do. So some brothers, for example, volunteered in a hospital. As chaplains, they would visit people in the hospital or do some form of social work or service. But this was at the height of the AIDS crisis in New York. And I, as a young man, felt called to do that ministry, and I was very frustrated because the Catholic Church was doing nothing for people with AIDS. The Catholic Church was so afraid of people with AIDS, because most people with AIDS at the time were people who were part of the gay community, or they were drug users. And so the church really wasn't sure what to do. I, in my thought, or I say in my prayer life, felt like Jesus with the lepers. You know how Jesus, during his life, there were people with leprosy, and they were shunned by society. The church said they were sinners. That's how they got leprosy, because they had sinned. And no one would associate them with them or talk with them, but Jesus loved them, and Jesus served them. And so I felt if I was going to be following in the steps of Jesus, then I should be serving the modern day lepers, who were people with AIDS at the time. But unfortunately, there just were no Catholic organizations working with people with AIDS. And one day, I do see it as something really miraculous. One day I opened up one of those free newspapers you get on the streets of New York, and in the back was this ad. This is the actual ad that was in the back. And it says, AIDS Ministry in the spirit of Francis of Assisi, serving your brothers and sisters affected by AIDS. And then there was an address on 31st Street. And I kind of saw it as like, wow, this is an answer to my prayer. I can get to do the AIDS work and be part of something that has to do with the church. And so I called the number that was there, and who picked up but Father Mychal Judge. I didn't know him. And he said, oh, you saw the ad, you're the first person to call. And so he said, come on down. And so I was living in Queens at the time, and I took the train into Manhattan, and I met with Father Mychal, and he said, okay, well, it's just us for now, but let's see what happens. We eventually grew to 5 people, and the 5 of us were St. Francis AIDS Ministry, and our headquarters were Michael's house. You know, Michael lived, as I showed you, at that friary on 31st Street. So that's where we would meet. And what we did during those years were, we visited people with AIDS in the hospital. We had prayer groups for caregivers and family members of people with AIDS. They would come to the church, and we would have a prayer group with them. And then my task as a young brother, oh, there's my identification card back then. Look how young I looked. But as you can see, I'm talking to a group of high schoolers there. So my role was to go to all of the Catholic high schools in Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan, and to talk to young people about AIDS. It was really, wonderful work. I was so grateful to be doing that ministry, and of course, getting to work with Father Mychal. And so I got to watch him at work with people with AIDS. You have to remember, I'm sure some of you do remember, it was a really scary time. And even when you walked into a hospital room, you had to wear a mask and gloves and be all covered up because people weren't sure how you got it and everybody was afraid. And I watched him, we walked into a hospital room and there was a man with AIDS, and he said to Father Mychal, he said, "Do you think God hates me?" And Father Mychal didn't say anything. He just took that man in his arms. And I couldn't believe it because we were told not to touch the people we were visiting because, again, it was a scary time. He just held the man. It was really remarkable. And I remember saying to him as a young man, I said, I don't know what to say. Like, you're older than me. I'm new at this. Like, if I walk into a hospital room, what if I don't know what to say? And he said, God will always give you the words to say. And if you don't hear anything, that means don't say anything. Just be present. Just be present. And oftentimes that's what I did. I would just sit there at the bedside. But again, it was such wonderful work. So here is a picture of St. Francis AIDS Ministry. There's Father Mychal marching at one of the gay pride parades in New York, which again was a huge thing for back then. For a Catholic priest to be walking in a gay pride parade, he was amazing. And you see that he's wearing his habit there, and he always wore it. He wore it on the subway. He wore it everywhere. Now, at the time, we young people who were in the church, we didn't want to wear the habit. We just wanted to fit in with everybody. So that habit you saw me wearing in that picture, I would wear it to church, but not out in the street. But I remember asking him once, I was like, why do you wear that everywhere? And he said, well, you know how when people see a police officer or a firefighter or a doctor or a nurse, they're easily identifiable because of what they're wearing. And he said, those are the people know to go to for help, just by the way they're dressed. He said, and I want people, when they see me, to know I'm a person you can come to for help. And so that's why he wore it everywhere. So I don't know, some of you living here on the East Coast back then may have been familiar with the fact that during that time of the AIDS crisis, the Catholic Church in New York and the gay community in New York were at odds with one another. And you see there it says, "Stop the Church. Cardinal O'Connor won't teach about safe sex. We're having a massive protest at St. Patrick's Cathedral." So there was an AIDS activist group called ACT UP, and this group was angry that the Catholic Church was doing nothing to help people with AIDS. In fact, this group felt that the Catholic Church was actually making things worse because all they would talk about was abstinence and kind of giving off a message that the people who had AIDS, they deserved it for being sinful. And so this group staged a protest at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, this is not a real picture. This is from a TV show. There's a TV show called Pose on the FX channel, which is about the AIDS crisis during that time. So this is a dramatization of what happened. But they had a massive protest at St. Patrick's Cathedral, where they all laid down there in the aisles during the middle of Mass as their protest. So this was a real struggle for me because I found that when I started to visit people with AIDS, they would say, "I don't want to talk to you. Please leave my hospital room." And one even said, "Get out." And the reason was because I wore a collar, and I was representing the church that they viewed as their enemy. And so Father Mychal and I had some really good talks about that, and I said, I don't know if I want to continue to represent this church that people view as being so judgmental and so hateful. But Father Mychal, he didn't seem deterred. In fact, he embraced this Catholic group in New York that was called Dignity. This was a group of gay and lesbian Catholics, and they would have Mass, and they would ask priests on Sunday to say Mass for them. And I think many of you know the Catholic Church said that being a gay was sinful. People who were gay could not receive communion or the sacraments or anything like that. And so Father Mychal embraced this group called Dignity, and he would say Mass on Sundays for gay and lesbian Catholics until Cardinal O'Connor found out about it. And then he forbade any priest from saying Mass for the group Dignity. But I was so impressed as a young man watching Father Mychal. He was so brave to be able to do that. He didn't seem to care about getting in trouble. So this is the friary where Father Mychal lived. The church is next door, and he lived up on the top floor in that window. And that's where on the ground floor we would have our AIDS ministry, and we had food pantry there and so on. Father Mychal said to me, "Oh, it would be wonderful if we could get school kids to put together little care kits, little care packages, that when we go visit people with AIDS, we can bring like little shoe boxes that are filled with, lotion and socks and things like that." And we asked around at Catholic schools, and no one would be willing to do it because it was for people with AIDS. And so he said, he goes, "Sal, you went to Catholic school?" And I said, "Yeah, in Queens." And he said, "Well, why don't you talk to the school you went to?" So I called the principal of the school and I told her who I was, and she said, "Sure." And the kids did it. They put together these little care packages, and Father Mychal came to my Catholic elementary school in Queens that I grew up in. He came, he met my parents, and talked to the kids and thanked them, and talked at each grade level, from 1st grade to 8th grade. We visited all the classrooms. He talked to them at an age-appropriate level about people with AIDS, because again, it was a very scary time. So during the AIDS crisis, there were a lot of fundraisers for AIDS in New York that a lot of celebrities were involved with. And Father Mychal had gotten 2 tickets to go to this swanky AIDS benefit where all of these celebrities were going to be. And he said, "Why don't you come with me?" And I was so thrilled because I was going to go to this place. I was at the Waldorf Astoria. So we're on our way there, and we run into a homeless person. And Father Mychal always, and again, having that bread line out in front of the church, he was very close to the homeless community in New York, and they loved him. And there's one story where a woman was cold, and he gave her his winter coat. And he said, "She needs it more than I do." Just gave her his coat. But we were walking to the AIDS benefit at the Waldorf Astoria, and a homeless man asked for food. And Father Mychal said, "Yeah." And so the 3 of us went over to a Burger King, and we had Burger King with this man. And then we went to the Waldorf Astoria for this fancy dinner. And among the celebrities there were Christopher Reeve. He was Superman at the time. This was before his accident. And there's Susan Sarandon. There were other people, Phil Donahue and Marlo Thomas, and all of these people. The reason I share this with you is because I watched Father Mychal interact and spend time with a homeless person, and then I watched him with the celebrities, and he was exactly the same. He talked to everybody on the same level. Didn't matter who they were, how much money they had, what their lot in life was. He just looked at he always looked everyone in the eye, talked to them with, he really did see the Christ light in everybody, regardless of who they were. I was so impressed with that as a young man. I always remembered it. And so whether he was talking to a teenager, a gay couple, old people in his parish, it didn't matter their age, who they were, he was just the same with everybody. And what's so remarkable is all these different types of groups, they claimed him as their priest. So he was the New York City fire chaplain, and you can imagine that group is a group of, macho guys. They were like, he's our priest. Then the gay community said, well, he's our priest. And then young people said, he's our priest, and the elderly said, he's our priest, and the celebrities welcomed him, and the poor. I mean, it's really remarkable. I've never seen anyone like that. Linda?
A question. So then, how did he keep his position in the friar if the diocese didn't agree with what he was doing? I mean, a lot of times they just move him on to something else.
Exactly right. Well, he was very fortunate that he was not a diocesan priest. He belonged to the Franciscans. So really, when he took that vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, it was obedience to the Franciscans, not to the Archdiocese of New York. And that's how he was able to get away with it without getting in trouble. Yeah, that's a good question.
I didn't know they were separate.
Yeah. So you can, when you become a priest, you can become part of a diocese, or you can join a religious order. There's lots of different religious orders, the Jesuits, and so on, the Dominicans. So here's Father Mychal, and he's with leaders of different faiths. There's a rabbi, there's a Hindu Swami, I think, and an imam from the Muslim faith. This is a picture of him as part of an interfaith group. So one of the things he was also really involved in was he was one of the leaders of the interfaith movement in New York. He really felt that all religious paths led to God, that there was many faiths, but there was only one God. And he would often explain, he would say, well, there's like many paths up a mountaintop. They're all going to the same mountaintop. They just have different ways of getting there. And he felt that we could all learn from each other. And so one night a month in Manhattan, they would have an interfaith group. And so every month was a different topic. So for example, one month the topic might be forgiveness. And they would all talk about forgiveness from their faith tradition, from their holy books. It was really fascinating, and I just fell in love with it. I just couldn't get enough of it. I just wanted to learn about all these different faiths. And Father Mychal introduced me to the rabbi there on your left. His name was Rabbi Joseph Gelberman. He just passed away a few years ago. And he, 30 years ago, when I knew him, founded a seminary for the training of interfaith ministers. Because he believed that all people who are going to go into ministry better learn not just about their own faith, but about all the other faiths as well. And so Rabbi Gelberman founded All Faiths Seminary. And there he is, and there I am, because I went to All Faiths Seminary, and I became ordained in All Faiths Seminary. And so I'm so grateful that Father Mychal introduced me to the rabbi and to just the idea that it's okay for us as Christians to learn about other faiths. It doesn't mean we're going to become the other faith. It just means now I have an understanding of my neighbor. Now I know what they believe. And what they believe really is in the same things we do. That golden rule of love your neighbor as yourself, love God, serve people. And so I'm grateful for Father Mychal for that too. But Father Mychal, his real love was St. Francis of Assisi. And if you know this St. Francis of Assisi prayer, then you know what Mychal Judge was like. It says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. Where there's injury, pardon. Where there's doubt, faith. Where there's despair, hope. Where there's darkness, light. Where there's sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may seek not so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we're born to eternal life. So that's really what he was about. He said, when there's hatred in the world, I'm going to bring love. Where there's darkness, I'm going to bring light. I never really met anyone who so fully embodied that prayer. So September 11th happened, and I learned, as everyone did, that Father Mychal died. And I decided that I was going to write a little book about him and my getting to know him. And I thought, that prayer that he taught me, other people should know that prayer. And so I wrote a little book called Mychal's Prayer. And here's the prayer. We would begin our AIDS ministry with this prayer. Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say. And keep me out of your way. It's such a simple prayer. I mean, it's just 4 lines that he composed, but we would say it every day, and it just stayed with me. Imagine just starting your day that way. God, whatever you have for me today, God, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Then each day kind of becomes like an adventure. Like, oh, who am I going to meet today? Who does God want me to meet? Tell me what you want me to say. Again, kind of like I asked as a young man. I said, I don't know what to say. God will give you the words. But then this one I love. Keep me out of your way. Because we're always wanting to control things, and our egos always want to get in the way, but to kind of let go and let God. So it's such a beautiful prayer. So I wrote a little book about it and how I incorporated it into my own life. So I have a few copies of the book there, and there's a little donation box. If you would like a copy of the book, any donation you can put in there would be great. It's not going to go to me. It's going to go to our church's roof fund. And you can also get the book on Amazon as well. So you will see now there are many icons, paintings, statues, to Father Mychal. He really, since his death, has touched so many people that never got to know him in life. It's such a remarkable thing. People around the world not only know now who Mychal Judge was, they actually pray to him. So there are these religious icons that people have drawn. They put them up in churches and on altars. And there is a call in the Catholic Church to make him a saint. And so a few years ago, I received a letter from Rome, from what's called a postulator. I'd never heard of that word before. But a postulator is a person in the Catholic Church who works on cases for canonization. And so a case has been opened to look into making Father Mychal Judge an official saint. And so I was asked to fill out a 15-page questionnaire about Father Mychal, and I returned it to Rome with a copy of my little book. Yes, Wendy.
What requirements does the head Catholic Church look for?
Yes. That's a great question, Wendy. So the key thing they're looking for are miracles. They're looking to see if there are 3 miracles that can be attributed to Father Mychal. And they don't have to be during his lifetime. They can be after his passing. So for example, someone might say, I was diagnosed with inoperable cancer, and I prayed to Father Mychal Judge each and every day, and I was cured. And the church may consider that a miracle. But to me, whether the church says he was a saint or not, he was a saint. Because, I mean, he lived his life in such a saintly way, which doesn't mean he was perfect. You know, when I was a little kid and I would hear about the saints, I thought like, oh, they're just so perfect. No one can ever be like that. But then to know Mychal, I mean, he was a real person. He had his flaws. As I said, he had a drinking problem. He struggled with his identity. He went through a lot. So he wasn't perfect. But every day he saw it as his role to, how can I serve God's people today? What can I do to be a loving presence in this world? How can I serve other people? It was always, always about that. To me, that's what it means to be a saint. So there are some wonderful books that have been written about Father Mychal Judge, biographies. So there's the Book of Mychal by Michael Daly. That was the first one. Michael Ford, who is a British journalist, wrote a book, Father Mychal Judge, An Authentic American Hero. And the latest book, it just came out last year, is Mychal Judge, Take Me Where You Want Me to Go, which is that line from the prayer. And I was interviewed for this book, and there's a little blurb on the back from me on his book.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
A silly question. We're talking about being imperfect.
Yeah.
Did he keep that tattoo? Keep the tattoo.
And I'm sure for him it was just a daily reminder when he, got out of the shower or whatever, to remember that moment where he had his wake-up call. That was his, rock bottom moment. So. There's also a children's book about Father Mychal, and again, it explains to kids in a way they would understand about who he was and what he did. So you see, it says he served as a chaplain to the NYPD. Many firefighters loved him. He was a loved priest and counselor. He was open about being gay with the friars whom he could trust, and the gay men of the streets of New York in the 80s and 90s. For his heroism, Father Mychal was designated the first recorded casualty. He declined to join city officials in an area of safety on the morning of 9/11. He insisted he needed to be with his men, his firefighters. And then this really wonderful quote from him. It says, "If no one told you today that they love you, let me tell you, I love you." Really beautiful. So if you go down to the World Trade Center memorial, obviously you will see Father Mychal's name there. And then also on West 31st Street, where the friary is, that street is now named Father Mychal Judge Street. So Father Mychal, this is an actual photo of him on the day before he died, September 10th. And on that day, he, like he did every day, said Mass. And this is his final sermon, or his final homily, or it's only part of it. But this was his final message that he gave the day before he died. During his homily, he said, "Turn to God each day. Put your faith and your trust and your hope and your life in His hands, and He'll take good care of you, and you'll have a good life. Isn't He a wonderful God? Isn't He good to you, to each one of you, and to me? You have no idea what God is calling you to, but He needs you. He needs me. He needs all of us." Well, that was his very last homily, his very last message. But so, again, it's just the truth. God takes care of us each and every day. Well, we just have to put our trust in that. God loves us so much, such a loving God, and is good to all of us. And then the last thing, God needs you. No matter what your age is, where you are in life, God needs you every single day to be God's light in the world, to be that love in the world. God needs you, He needs me, God needs all of us. Now, I certainly had no idea when I was working with Father Mychal that God was calling me away from the Catholic Church and into this denomination in this church where I'm serving now, the United Church of Christ. But I am so grateful because the United Church of Christ has become a place where I can still serve God and use my gifts for ministry, but where I can be 100% fully myself. I don't have to hide anything about myself. I can be my authentic self in the United Church of Christ. And I think, although Father Mychal never got to see me as a UCC minister, I think he is smiling down and is so happy that I have found my home. And I'm sure he was very delighted on the day of my ordination that there were 3 women. You know, most churches, you think the denomination, the people who are going to come are going to be men to officially install you. I had 3 women leaders from the United Church of Christ who installed me. So I know Father Mychal would have been very pleased about that. As we just heard, he was so inclusive and so supportive of all people and women in ministry. But I'm especially sure that he must have been so happy when his successor was named as the New York City fire chaplain. You know, they had to name a few years ago a new New York City fire chaplain. And for the very first time, they chose a woman. And there she is with her wife and her children, and she's an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Isn't that wonderful? So I know Mychal is smiling, and I'm going to end with just that beautiful picture of him smiling. So, well, that's Father Mychal Judge, Mychal's prayer. Questions?
Story about the AIDS crisis?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the microphones. So we can hear you.
I was a nurse.
Louder.
I was a nurse at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and I was a student working where there were people with AIDS there in the hospital, maybe with pneumonia that they got from AIDS, and people didn't go in their rooms. Even some of the nurses, the health workers, did not go in their rooms, and they were really alone. So I would go in their rooms just to be somebody who could go in their rooms. And I also remember there was this other room for young children, like toddlers, and they were exposed to AIDS, and people wouldn't go in their rooms either. And they were crying, and, you know, they had some toys, but it took a while for people to get used to that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you had first-hand knowledge, a first-hand experience of that. I'm so grateful that you were a loving presence and went into the rooms. But yes, so many nurses and medical people were afraid to go into the rooms. They would just leave the food there on the floor, and you're very sad. You know, I talked to young people who obviously lived, they were born, you know, decades after the AIDS crisis. You know, they don't understand any of that. They can't imagine that. But we all lived through it. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone have any questions about Father Mychal or anything you wanted to know more about? Yes.
I have a question. I just have a comment. I remember Steve and I were watching the whole thing that day.
Yeah.
And we were just glued to the TV. And they showed Father Judge in the lobby of one of the towers, administering, talking to the firemen and, you know, doing whatever, praying for them, whatever. And then 10 minutes later, it was announced that Father Judge had died. And they showed the picture, that picture that you showed, and I'm getting chills right now because I think I started crying. There was a whole thing, and I'm surprised they don't show him in something about him. They don't even mention him. we watched it again, 'cause I taped everything, and we watch it every
But
year.
if you watch the 60
We
minutes.
watched everything, no, I didn't see 50 minutes. I taped
That was
everything.
wonderful.
I
and they
taped
did
everything, I
every-
taped about 10 hours of everything that, that was on
The
yesterday.
60 minutes one went through the entire
It was,
whole day.
that was the entire
Absolutely
With Father Judge, too.
Enormously impactful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
We didn't put it on.
As you mentioned, Linda, there were news crews there. It was Eyewitness News had footage of Father Mychal there.
And they talked about how they put him on the altar.
Yes.
Yeah. The whole thing was.
Yeah. So if you, I'm sure we can. If you haven't seen the 60 Minutes piece, I didn't. We'll be able to find it online. But also that movie I was talking about, The Saint of 9/11. They have all of that footage in that documentary. But yes, I like.
Where do we find that?
So if you have Amazon Prime, if you can get movies streaming on Amazon Prime, you can get it there.
Oh, okay.
And you can also get it on YouTube. If you just type in The Saint of 9/11 in YouTube, you'll be able to find it there. Someone else?
I
Yes,
just had
Stephanie.
a question. Because of his, Mychal Judge, because of his, all of his work with the gay people, and he was known to be gay himself, et cetera, do you think the Catholic Church, the diocese, would turn him down to be a saint?
It's possible. So there's a magazine called the National Catholic Reporter, and for the 20th anniversary of 9/11, so in 2021, they did an article, and it said something about will there ever be a gay saint, is what it said.
Oh.
And it was about Father Mychal Judge, and would the church canonize someone who, so I will say just on that issue, so Father Mychal was open about being gay to people in his life, to the other friars that he lived with, to friends, but it wasn't something that was publicly declared or that many people knew. And I will say this, he was just a person who was very faithful to his vows. I don't know if he ever was with a person, man or woman, but his attractions, were to men, but he was faithful to being a celibate person. He took his vows very seriously. But it'll be interesting to see if the church did canonize him. That would certainly be a huge deal. Yeah. I mean, I hope it happens only in the sense of more and more people then will hear about him. It's incredible how more people more people got to know him after his death than knew him alive. And it just kind of gets to that idea of legacy. All of us, after we pass away, our legacy will live on in the impact we made in the world and all the lives we touched. Anyone else have a question? Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm always so grateful for the opportunity to share about Father Mychal and his prayer. So again, if you'd like a copy of the book, it's on the table, or you can get it online.